Case 1, February 12, 2010, Huntsville, Alabama. A routine faculty meeting at the University of Alabama in Huntsville ended in gunfire after an academic career reached its final collapse. Amy Bishop, a tenure-track professor facing professional rejection, attended the meeting knowing the decision that had defined her future was no longer reversible. The denial of tenure had placed her career under scrutiny and set a fixed end date on her position. Within the walls of a science building, a professional dispute escalated into lethal violence, transforming an ordinary academic gathering into one of the deadliest workplace shootings in university history. The case began shortly before 4:00 p.m. inside a third-floor conference room at the Shelby Center for Science and Technology. Approximately a dozen faculty members gathered for a routine departmental meeting. Bishop arrived without drawing attention and remained seated for more than half an hour. Without warning, she stood, produced a Ruger P95-9 handgun, and began firing at close range. 3 faculty members were fatally shot, including the department chair. Several others were wounded, including one professor who survived with permanent injuries. When the weapon stopped firing, surviving faculty barricaded the door, believing the shooter might return. Bishop exited the building and was taken into custody outside without resistance. The evidence at the scene did not support any claim of spontaneous confusion or accident. The victims were established academics with long careers in biological research and teaching. They were colleagues who had worked alongside Bishop for years within the same department. Bishop herself was a Harvard-trained neurobiologist who joined the university in 2003 as an assistant professor. Married with 4 children, she appeared professionally successful, but had failed to secure the tenure required to remain at the institution. In March 2009, the university formally denied her tenure application, setting the spring 2010 semester as her final term. She pursued multiple appeals, retained legal counsel, and challenged the decision for months. Each appeal was rejected. By February 2010, her employment was ending, and her academic identity was effectively terminated. It would take only days for the consequences of that decision to fully unfold. Police arrested Bishop outside the building minutes after the shooting. She was transported to jail while investigators processed the crime scene and interviewed survivors. Attention quickly shifted beyond the immediate attack when background checks revealed a prior fatal incident. In 1986, Bishop had shot and killed her younger brother at their family home in Massachusetts. At the time, the death was ruled accidental and no charges were filed. Records showed irregularities in the original investigation, including missing files and unshared evidence. As detectives reviewed Bishop's history, they identified patterns of prior violence that had not resulted in accountability. The focus of the investigation expanded beyond Huntsville, drawing attention to earlier institutional failures. Then, decades-old evidence resurfaced, forcing prosecutors to revisit a case long considered closed. Massachusetts authorities reopened the 1986 killing of Bishop's brother and convened a grand jury. Investigators determined that key information, including an attempted carjacking shortly after the shooting, had never been forwarded to prosecutors. In June 2010, Bishop was formally indicted on first-degree murder charges in Massachusetts, nearly 24 years after the death. Meanwhile, in Alabama, she initially pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity to the university shootings. Legal proceedings unfolded across state lines as prosecutors coordinated charges, evidence, and custody. In 2012, after negotiations and objections from victims, families regarding the death penalty, Bishop changed her plea to guilty. When confronted with the cumulative evidence, her legal strategy shifted, closing the door on a contested trial. On September 24, 2012, Amy Bishop was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the Huntsville killings. The Massachusetts murder charge related to her brother was later dismissed, with prosecutors citing the existing life sentence. She was transferred to a women's correctional facility in Alabama, where she remains incarcerated. Reviews of the case highlighted multiple missed warning signs and procedural failures across institutions and decades. The earlier investigation into her brother's death remained unresolved in terms of accountability. While the legal outcome was final, questions persisted regarding how prior violence had gone unaddressed. To this day, the case remains a reference point in discussions of institutional oversight and delayed justice. Case 2. November 27, 1980, Reno, Nevada. Thanksgiving afternoon brought crowds into the downtown casino district as tourists and families filled the sidewalks along Virginia Street. Stores were open, casinos were busy, and pedestrians moved freely through the holiday atmosphere. Shortly before mid-afternoon, an ordinary shopping corridor became the site of a mass casualty event. What initially appeared to some witnesses as a traffic accident was quickly identified as a deliberate act of violence, turning a public holiday into one of the deadliest days in the city's history. At approximately 2:45 p.m., Priscilla Joyce Ford entered her blue 1974 Lincoln Continental and drove toward the crowded sidewalk near the Reno Hilton and the Nevada Club Casino. Instead of remaining in traffic, she accelerated onto the pedestrian walkway. The vehicle reached an estimated speed of 40 miles per hour as it traveled more than 100 feet along the sidewalk. Pedestrians were struck without warning, several thrown into the air on impact. The vehicle came to rest only after hitting a concrete structure. When the car stopped, multiple victims lay motionless along the pavement. Emergency responders arrived within minutes to a scene marked by bodies, debris, and confusion. 6 people were pronounced dead, and more than 20 others suffered injuries. The damage pattern and eyewitness accounts indicated the act was intentional, not accidental. Ford was 51 years old at the time of the attack. She was a former schoolteacher from Michigan with a documented history of mental illness. Medical records showed diagnoses of paranoid schizophrenia and violent ideation dating back to the early 1970s. She had been treated at multiple psychiatric institutions and released repeatedly. Ford believed she possessed divine identity and authority and had fixated on the removal of her daughter by child welfare authorities years earlier. The separation remained central to her delusions. Prior to arriving in Reno, she had made explicit threats stating that people would die if her daughter was not returned. These statements were reported but did not result in long-term confinement. Her fixation escalated over time, culminating in her return to Reno weeks before Thanksgiving. Ford remained inside her vehicle following the attack and was taken into custody at the scene without resistance. Officers administered a blood alcohol test that later showed a level of .162, more than twice the legal limit. Investigators reviewed her personal history and uncovered a pattern of warnings that had gone unheeded. Prior threats to commit vehicular violence had been documented by law enforcement and federal authorities years earlier. Statements made after her arrest confirmed awareness of the harm caused. Witnesses and officers reported no attempt to flee. The investigation focused on establishing intent, mental competency, and prior notice. Evidence demonstrated that the vehicle was mechanically sound and that steering inputs were deliberate. The case proceeded rapidly toward prosecution as authorities prepared to address both criminal responsibility and mental health claims. Ford's trial began in November 1981 following an extended jury selection process. She entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. During proceedings, her statements and testimony reinforced the presence of severe delusional beliefs. Prosecutors presented evidence of prior threats, deliberate acceleration, and post-arrest conduct. The jury rejected the insanity defense, concluding that Ford understood the nature of her actions. In March 1982, she was convicted on 6 counts of murder and multiple counts of attempted murder. The verdict reflected the finding that mental illness did not remove criminal responsibility under state law. Sentencing followed shortly afterward, with the court imposing the death penalty. Ford was transferred to Nevada State Prison, where she spent more than 2 decades on death row. She remained largely compliant during incarceration and accumulated no significant disciplinary record. Her sentence was never carried out. On January 29, 2005, at the age of 75, Priscilla Joyce Ford died from complications related to emphysema. Her death ended the legal process but left unresolved questions about institutional response to repeated warnings. The case remained a reference point in discussions of mental illness, public safety, and the consequences of untreated threats. Case 3. November 11, 2016, Oakland, California. A late-night visit framed as reconciliation ended in a residential neighborhood transformed into a homicide scene. What began as a private meeting between former associates concluded with 3 people dead, a garage fire burning, and a suspect emerging covered in blood. Within hours, the case shifted from an apparent domestic incident into a calculated triple homicide tied to loyalty, control, and long-simmering conflict. Shortly after 12:30 a.m., residents on Dunsmuir Drive reported hearing multiple gunshots. Officers responding to the call found a young man lying in the street outside a single-family home, suffering from a gunshot wound to the torso. He was pronounced dead at the scene. As police secured the area, they noticed smoke and fire coming from the garage of the same residence. While firefighters worked to contain the flames, officers heard movement inside the house. Moments later, Dana Rivers exited the residence. Rivers' clothing was soaked with blood, and officers detected the smell of gasoline. Inside the home, investigators discovered 2 additional victims in a bedroom, both shot and stabbed repeatedly. The scene indicated a sustained and violent attack rather than a spontaneous altercation. The victims were members of the same household. Charlotte Reed was a United States Air Force veteran and small business owner. She lived at the residence with her wife, Patricia Wright, a semi-retired educator, and Wright's 19-year-old son, Benny Diamu Wright, a college student working part-time while pursuing a nursing career. Reed and Rivers had known each other through an all-women motorcycle club known as the Deviants. Rivers had served as an enforcer within the group, a role centered on maintaining discipline and loyalty. When Reed decided to leave the club, tensions developed between the two. Despite the strained history, Reed allowed Rivers to stay at the home that night, believing the conflict had de-escalated. That assumption proved fatal. Investigators recovered extensive physical evidence from the scene. Blood trails connected the interior rooms to the garage, where an attempt had been made to ignite a fire. Multiple weapons were located, including knives and ammunition found on Rivers at the time of arrest. Autopsies confirmed that Reed and Patricia Wright had each been shot twice and stabbed numerous times, while Benny Wright had been shot during an apparent attempt to flee the residence. Rivers was taken into custody immediately and transported for questioning. According to police records, Rivers made spontaneous statements acknowledging involvement in the killings. The crime scene evidence, combined with Rivers' condition at arrest, established a direct link to all 3 deaths. Legal proceedings were delayed for years as courts evaluated Rivers' mental competency to stand trial. Psychological assessments were conducted repeatedly between 2017 and 2022, postponing courtroom proceedings while Rivers remained in custody. Prosecutors argued the acts demonstrated planning and intent, citing the use of multiple weapons, the attempted arson, and the sequence of killings. Rivers entered pleas of not guilty by reason of insanity, asserting diminished responsibility. The court ultimately ruled Rivers competent to stand trial, allowing the case to proceed. Jury selection and testimony finally began in October 2022, nearly 6 years after the killings. On November 15, 2022, the jury returned guilty verdicts on 3 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of arson of an inhabited dwelling. In January 2023, the presiding judge formally rejected the insanity defense, stating the evidence showed deliberation, control, and an effort to conceal the crimes. On June 14, 2023, Dana Rivers was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The court concluded the murders were intentional and premeditated. Rivers remains incarcerated, and the case stands as an example of how personal allegiance and perceived betrayal escalated into fatal violence. Case 4. May 1, 1990, Derry, New Hampshire. A quiet residential condominium became the center of a homicide investigation after what initially appeared to be a burglary gone wrong. The crime scene suggested forced entry and theft, but inconsistencies in the narrative quickly raised concern among investigators. Within days, the focus shifted away from unknown intruders and toward a carefully constructed conspiracy involving manipulation, secrecy, and calculated planning. On the evening of May 1, Gregory Smart returned to his condominium after work. Inside the residence, he was confronted by two teenage boys who had entered earlier and waited in silence. He was forced to his knees and shot at close range, dying at the scene. The assailants ransacked the condominium to simulate a robbery before fleeing. Later that night, Pamela Smart arrived home and discovered her husband's body. Police responded to what initially appeared to be a home invasion homicide. However, the absence of forced entry and the selective nature of the stolen items suggested staging. Investigators noted irregularities in the timeline and behavior of the reporting party. The physical evidence did not align with a random burglary, prompting a deeper examination of the circumstances surrounding the killing. Gregory Smart was a 24-year-old insurance salesman with no known enemies. Pamela Smart was 22 years old and worked as a media coordinator at a local high school. She held a college degree and was ribbed as ambitious and professionally driven. During her employment, she began an illicit sexual relationship with a teenage student. The relationship developed into sustained contact and emotional dependency. Over time, Pamela expressed dissatisfaction with her marriage and concern over financial and social consequences of divorce. The student involved believed the relationship was exclusive and permanent. Investigators later determined that Pamela used emotional pressure and threats of abandonment to influence the teenager's actions. The connection between authority, age imbalance, and dependence became central to understanding how the crime unfolded. The investigation advanced when individuals within Pamela Smart's social circle came forward. A teenage intern who worked alongside Pamela reported prior knowledge of the murder plot. Law enforcement obtained recordings in which Pamela discussed the crime after it occurred, including statements suggesting control and intimidation. These recordings provided direct evidence of orchestration rather than coincidence. Police reconstructed communications between Pamela and the teenage perpetrators, establishing planning that occurred weeks before the killing. The focus shifted fully to conspiracy rather than burglary. Investigators documented coordinated actions, rehearsed alibis, and instructions provided in advance. The accumulated evidence contradicted Pamela's initial statements and established her role as the central organizer. Pamela Smart was arrested later in 1990 and charged with conspiracy to commit murder, accomplice to first-degree murder, and witness tampering. Prosecutors structured their case around manipulation and abuse of authority rather than physical presence at the scene. The teenage perpetrators cooperated with authorities in exchange for reduced sentences, providing testimony outlining the planning and pressure applied. The prosecution emphasized the imbalance of power and sustained influence over vulnerable individuals. The strategy focused on intent, orchestration, and coercion rather than direct action. The evidence demonstrated that the crime was executed by others but directed by Pamela Smart. The trial began in 1991 and received national media attention, becoming one of the first widely televised criminal trials in the United States. The jury heard recorded evidence and testimony detailing the relationship and planning process. Pamela Smart was convicted on all charges and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Her conviction prompted extensive public debate about teacher misconduct and power dynamics. Over the years, she filed multiple petitions for clemency, all of which were denied. The case remained a lasting example of how manipulation, rather than physical force, resulted in a calculated homicide. Case 5. August 20, 1982, Miami, Florida. A routine business disagreement escalated into one of the deadliest workplace attacks in the city's history. A dispute over a small repair bill at an industrial shop ended with multiple fatalities and raised serious questions about ignored warning signs. What unfolded that morning revealed how documented instability, when left unmanaged, could culminate in sudden and irreversible violence. On the morning of August 20, Carl Robert Brown arrived at Bob Moore's Welding and Machine Service on Northwest 36th Street. The previous day, Brown had argued with employees over a $20 charge related to a repair and left the shop visibly angry. During the argument, he made statements indicating he would return and kill everyone, comments that were not reported to authorities. When he returned less than 24 hours later, he was armed with a 12-gauge shotgun purchased earlier that day. Brown entered the shop and began firing methodically at employees in the office, welding area, and machine room. Several workers were struck at close range. By the time the shooting ended, 6 people were dead, 2 were mortally wounded, and others were injured. Brown exited the building calmly after the attack. The victims included shop employees and customers ranging in age from teenagers to elderly workers. Most had no prior connection to Brown beyond being present at the shop. Brown was 51 years old and had worked for years as a history teacher in the Miami area. In the months leading up to the shooting, his behavior had deteriorated significantly. He had been placed on medical leave due to severe anxiety, paranoia, and erratic conduct. Neighbors reported gunfire from his home and increasingly unstable behavior. A psychiatric evaluation conducted earlier in the year documented paranoid ideation and impaired judgment, but concluded he was not a danger to others. Despite repeated concerns from family members and colleagues, no involuntary commitment or law enforcement intervention occurred. Immediately after the shooting, Brown fled the scene on a bicycle. Witnesses reported seeing wounded employees escape into nearby streets seeking help. Civilians in the area, alerted by reports of the massacre, attempted to locate the shooter. Several blocks from the shop, Brown was identified riding his bicycle near Miami International Airport. 2 men confronted him, one armed with a handgun. During the encounter, Brown raised his shotgun. A gunshot struck Brown, and moments later, he was hit by a vehicle during the confrontation. Emergency responders arrived shortly afterward. Brown was pronounced dead at the scene. 20 unused shotgun shells were found in his pockets. Because Brown died during the confrontation, there was no arrest or criminal trial. The investigation instead focused on reconstructing the timeline of events and reviewing Brown's background. Authorities confirmed the weapon purchase, documented the prior business dispute, and reviewed mental health records. Statements from family members revealed that just hours before the shooting, Brown had attempted to involve his young son in violent plans. Efforts by relatives to seek emergency assistance had failed due to jurisdictional confusion. Investigators concluded the shooting was premeditated and that Brown acted alone. In the aftermath, attention turned toward systemic failures. Records showed that Brown's deteriorating condition had been documented by medical professionals, employers, and family members. Despite repeated warnings, no coordinated intervention occurred. The case prompted discussion about mental health evaluations, workplace threat reporting, and the limits of voluntary treatment. Survivors and families of the victims continued to live with the consequences of decisions that went unaddressed. The massacre remained a reference point in debates over institutional responsibility and the cost of ignoring clear warning signs. Case 6. 1972, Florida. A sheriff's deputy patrolled public roads while using the authority of his badge to conceal predatory behavior. At a time when trust in law enforcement remained largely unquestioned, disappearances of young women began to occur across multiple counties. The connection between these crimes and a uniformed officer went unnoticed until survivors exposed conduct that contradicted the role Schieffer had been assigned to uphold. On July 21, 1972, Gerard John Schieffer encountered two teenage girls hitchhiking near Fort Pierce. Using his patrol car and authority, he offered them a ride under the appearance of protection. Instead of transporting them safely, he drove to a secluded wooded area. There, he forced the girls out of the vehicle at gunpoint, bound them to trees, and placed nooses around their necks. Schieffer told them he intended to return later to kill them. A radio call interrupted the assault, requiring his immediate presence elsewhere. He left the girls restrained, stating he would come back. The victims managed to free themselves and reported the incident to authorities. Their escape prevented what investigators later determined would likely have been two additional murders. Schieffer had struggled to maintain professional stability prior to joining law enforcement. He had been dismissed from teaching positions due to inappropriate behavior towards students and warned against holding positions of authority. Despite this history, he was hired by the Martin County Sheriff's Department in June 1972. The badge provided him with access, credibility, and control over vulnerable individuals. His victims were primarily young women who trusted his authority. Schieffer's failures in education, religion, and other careers preceded his law enforcement role, but did not prevent his appointment. The authority he gained enabled his crimes and delayed scrutiny, allowing him to operate without immediate detection. Following the hitchhiking incident, Schieffer was arrested, stripped of his badge, and charged with assault and false imprisonment. He posted bail and was released. 2 months later, two teenage girls, Susan Place and Georgia Jessup, disappeared from Fort Lauderdale. Investigators executed search warrants on Schieffer's residence and his mother's home. Inside, they discovered personal belongings belonging to missing women, including jewelry, clothing, and human remains. Officers also uncovered extensive written material authored by Schieffer, describing abductions, torture, and murder in detail. He claimed the writings were fictional, but investigators determined they aligned closely with real unsolved cases. Schieffer was charged with multiple counts of murder following the discovery of remains on Hutchinson Island. The victims had been bound to trees and strangled using nooses, matching descriptions in his writings. During trial proceedings in 1973, prosecutors presented survivor testimony, physical evidence, and Schieffer's own documents. The jury returned guilty verdicts on 2 counts of first-degree murder. Schieffer received 2 consecutive life sentences. Authorities aided the evidence suggested additional victims, though charges were limited to cases supported by recovered remains. Schieffer remained incarcerated at Florida State Prison, where he continued to boast about his crimes and claimed responsibility for dozens of additional murders. Investigators believed the true number of victims exceeded those proven in court, but many cases remained unresolved. On December 3, 1995, Schieffer was attacked in his cell by another inmate and killed. His death ended the possibility of further prosecutions. Numerous disappearances linked to his movements were never conclusively resolved, leaving families without definitive answers and reinforcing the lasting impact of authority misused. Case 7. July 26, 2025, Arkansas. A summer hiking trail inside Devil's Den State Park became the site of a double homicide that shattered a family outing and triggered a statewide manhunt. What began as a routine walk through a public nature reserve ended with 2 adults dead and their children left alone on the trail. The crime introduced immediate fear into surrounding communities and raised questions about how a suspect had moved unnoticed through multiple institutions before the violence occurred. On the afternoon of July 26, Clinton David Brink, age 43, and Kristen Amanda Brink, age 41, were hiking with their two daughters, ages 7 and 9, inside Devil's Den State Park. While on the trail, they encountered a lone man later identified as Andrew James Mann. Without warning, the encounter escalated into a violent attack. Both parents were stabbed repeatedly, sustaining fatal injuries. Witnesses later reported seeing a man emerge from the trail with visible blood on his face and hands before entering a dark-colored vehicle and leaving the area at speed. The Brink children were found alive but alone on the trail by another hiker, physically unharmed but unable to provide details beyond the immediate aftermath. The scene indicated a sudden and deliberate act of violence. The victims were a married couple known for their involvement in their children's lives and outdoor activities. They had no documented conflicts or associations, suggesting targeted risk. Andrew James Mann was 28 years old and worked as an elementary school teacher. His employment history showed movement across multiple school districts in Texas, Oklahoma, and Arkansas. In prior positions, parents had raised concerns regarding boundary issues and inappropriate attention towards students. Each time, Mann was placed on administrative leave or cleared through internal reviews, after which he resigned and relocated. He continued passing background checks and securing new teaching positions. These prior concerns did not result in criminal charges or licensing restrictions, allowing continued access to public spaces and vulnerable populations. Authorities launched an immediate search following the attack. Law enforcement agencies coordinated across county and state lines to identify the suspect and vehicle. Surveillance footage from nearby roadways captured a black Kia Stinger leaving the park vicinity around the time of the killings. Investigators collected blood evidence from the trail and canvassed nearby towns. Public alerts were issued as officers tracked vehicle sightings reported by residents. The search continued for several days as tips narrowed the suspect's movements. The investigation focused on reconstructing Mann's travel route and identifying places he might attempt to blend into normal daily activity. The absence of prior criminal records complicated early identification efforts. On July 30, 2025, 4 days after the killings, officers located Andrew James Mann at a barbershop in Springdale, Arkansas. He was taken into custody without incident while receiving a haircut. Physical examination revealed cuts on his hands consistent with a stabbing attack. DNA testing later confirmed that blood recovered from the crime scene matched Mann. During questioning, investigators reported that Mann made statements acknowledging involvement in the killings. The vehicle linked to the crime was recovered and processed for forensic evidence. The arrest ended the active search and allowed prosecutors to formally proceed with charges. Mann was charged with 2 counts of capital murder. During arraignment proceedings, prosecutors outlined evidence indicating the attack was deliberate rather than random. The case drew national attention due to Mann's employment history and prior warning signs that had not resulted in intervention. Reviews began examining how multiple school districts had addressed complaints and how background check systems failed to identify escalating risk. Mann remained in custody awaiting trial. The case continued to be cited in discussions about institutional oversight, reporting mechanisms, and the consequences of unresolved behavioral warnings. Case 8. January 15, 1989, Greenburgh, New York. A quiet suburban home became the scene of an execution-style killing when a woman was found shot 9 times in the face. The brutality of the attack suggested personal motive rather than random violence. As investigators began reconstructing the victim's final hours, attention shifted toward a private relationship marked by secrecy, fixation, and unresolved obsession. Emergency responders were called to the Solomon residence during the afternoon hours of January 15. Inside, they found 40-year-old Betty Jean Solomon deceased, her body bearing multiple gunshot wounds concentrated to the face and head. There were no signs of forced entry, and the house showed no evidence of a struggle. Betty's husband, Paul Solomon, was not present at the time of the shooting and reported discovering the body upon returning home from work. Initial questioning focused on his whereabouts and routine. While his alibi appeared stable, investigators noted the precision of the attack and the absence of robbery indicators. The manner of death suggested the shooter was familiar with the home and the victim. The case immediately shifted toward identifying someone with access and motive. Betty Solomon was a wife and mother living in an affluent Westchester County community. Her husband worked as an elementary school teacher. Carolyn Warmus was a colleague of Paul Solomon at the same school and was born into significant wealth. She held degrees in psychology and education and had no history of financial instability. Investigators determined that Warmus and Paul Solomon had engaged in an on-and-off extramarital affair lasting more than a year. Evidence showed Warmus became increasingly fixated on Solomon and expressed distress over his refusal to leave his marriage. Witnesses described a pattern in which Warmus pursued emotionally unavailable men. As Solomon attempted to distance himself, the imbalance between expectation and reality intensified. The relationship dynamics became central to understanding motive. The investigation uncovered evidence linking Warmus to the means of the crime. Records showed she had acquired a .25 caliber Beretta handgun through an intermediary. Witnesses placed her in the vicinity of the Solomon residence on the day of the murder. A black glove discovered near the body was believed to belong to Warmus and contained traces consistent with blood evidence. However, questions arose regarding evidence handling and timing. The prosecution relied on circumstantial connections tying Warmus to the weapon, the glove, and the relationship. Defense attorneys challenged the integrity of the investigation and suggested alternative explanations, including evidence manipulation. These disputes became central as the case moved toward trial. Warmus was arrested and charged with second-degree murder and weapons violations. Her first trial began in January 1991, but ended in a hung jury after days of deliberation. Prosecutors chose to retry the case. Prior to the second trial, Paul Solomon reported discovering the previously missing glove inside his home, a development that significantly strengthened the prosecution's argument. The second trial commenced in January 1992. This time, the jury found the evidence sufficient to convict. Warmus was found guilty on all charges. The conviction rested on cumulative circumstantial evidence rather than direct eyewitness testimony. In June 1992, Carolyn Warmus was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. She maintained her innocence throughout incarceration, repeatedly asserting the glove had been planted and that evidence had been mishandled. After serving more than 25 years, she was granted parole in June 2019. Following her release, Warmus continued to seek DNA testing of the glove evidence. The case remained disputed in public discourse, with unresolved questions regarding evidence handling and motive. Case 9. March 24, 2016. St. Louis, Missouri. A young elementary school teacher was found dead inside her apartment, ending a life that had been quietly entangled in secrecy and deception. What initially appeared to be a targeted killing soon revealed a calculated plan rooted in abuse of authority, concealed relationships, and deliberate orchestration. Within days, investigators identified that the crime was not spontaneous, but the result of a murder-for-hire scheme executed with precision. In the early morning hours of March 24, Jocelyn Peters was seated at her kitchen table inside her West Pine Boulevard apartment, working on baby shower invitations. She was several months pregnant. Using a key, the gunman entered without force. Peters was shot once in the head with a .38 caliber firearm, the weapon fitted with a makeshift silencer. She died at the scene. No signs of struggle were present. Later that morning, Cornelius Green arrived and called 911, reporting the discovery of her body. The controlled nature of the crime scene and the absence of robbery indicated a PL. and execution rather than random violence. The killing bore the hallmarks of premeditation. Jocelyn Peters was 30 years old and taught second and third grade at an elementary school in St. Louis. She was described as dedicated to her students and deeply invested in her future as a teacher and mother. Cornelius Green was the principal of a nearby middle school and 15 years her senior. He was married and maintained multiple relationships simultaneously. Peters believed Green intended to leave his marriage and build a life with her. Unbeknownst to her, Green had been researching methods to terminate the pregnancy without her knowledge. When those plans failed, investigators later determined he began pursuing permanent solutions to preserve his double life. Detectives traced a series of communications between Green and a longtime associate, Philip Cutler. Phone records showed detailed planning discussions in the weeks before the killing. Financial records revealed Green had stolen approximately $2,500 from a school dance team fundraiser and shipped the cash to Cutler using a parcel service. The package was sent from Green's school address. Surveillance footage and travel records confirmed Green boarded an Amtrak train to Chicago shortly before the murder, leaving behind keys to his apartment, vehicle, and Peters' residence. The timeline demonstrated intentional alibi construction and coordination. Cutler was arrested and questioned shortly after the killing. During interrogation, he confessed to carrying out the shooting and detailed Green's role in planning, funding, and facilitating the crime. He described being provided access to the apartment and receiving confirmation calls before and after the killing. Physical evidence corroborated his account. Investigators recovered purchase records for the firearm and materials used as a silencer. Phone logs placed Green and Cutler in communication immediately after the murder. The confession shifted the case from circumstantial suspicion to direct conspiracy. In February 2024, Cornelius Green pleaded guilty to murder for hire and conspiracy charges in federal court. During sentencing proceedings, prosecutors outlined the extensive planning and betrayal involved. On June 5, 2024, Green was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms with eligibility for parole only after 50 years. He was remanded into federal custody. The case prompted reviews of institutional oversight and misconduct by individuals in positions of authority. The conviction closed the legal process, but left enduring questions about how power and deception enabled the crime. Case 10, 1996–1998, Poughkeepsie, New York. Over a 2-year period, women disappeared from the streets while the man responsible lived openly in a family home, unnoticed by authorities and neighbors alike. The pattern of vanishings went largely unconnected as the city struggled to recognize a serial threat operating in plain sight. Behind closed doors, evidence accumulated silently, concealed within a residence shared by multiple family members. The first confirmed killing occurred on October 24, 1996, when Kendall Francois picked up 30-year-old Wendy Mayers. During their encounter, he strangled her until she lost consciousness and then drowned her in a bathtub. After her death, he transported her body back to his family home and hid it in the attic. Over the following months, additional murders followed. Each time, Francois returned with the bodies and concealed them within the same residence. The killings occurred without forced entry or disturbance to the household structure. The concealment allowed the crimes to continue undetected as victims were reported missing across the city. Francois targeted women who shared similar characteristics and social vulnerability. Most were sex workers, making their disappearances less likely to trigger immediate, coordinated investigations. At the time of the murders, Francois was employed as a school aide at Arlington Middle School, where he monitored detention halls and interacted daily with students. Colleagues reported inappropriate behavior toward female students, including unwanted physical contact and sexual remarks. Despite complaints, no formal disciplinary action removed him from the position. His employment provided routine, structure, and an appearance of normalcy that deflected suspicion while the killings continued. The investigation progressed slowly as missing persons cases accumulated without a clear link. In early 1998, police interviewed Francois after reports from sex workers described a large man who exhibited violent behavior during encounters. No charges resulted. Later that year, a survivor escaped an assault attempt and identified Francois as her attacker. She reported being strangled and narrowly escaping after convincing him to drive her to a populated area. Her report prompted renewed scrutiny and led detectives to re-examine earlier complaints. During questioning, Francois admitted to killing one of the missing women, providing investigators with their first direct confession. Based on the confession, authorities obtained a search warrant for the Francois family home. On September 2, 1998, investigators entered the residence and discovered multiple bodies hidden in the attic and crawl spaces in various stages of decomposition. The discovery explained months of complaints from neighbors regarding an overwhelming odor emanating from the house. 7 bodies were recovered during the search, with additional evidence confirming an 8th victim. The scale of the concealment shocked investigators and raised questions about how the crimes remained undetected for so long. Francois was indicted on multiple counts of first and second-degree murder. Prosecutors initially sought the death penalty, but later agreed to a plea deal to avoid trial. In August 2000, Francois was sentenced to 8 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, along with additional concurrent sentences totaling hundreds of years. He was incarcerated at state correctional facilities, where he later died in custody in 2014 from complications related to illness. The case exposed systemic failures in addressing missing persons reports and demonstrated how sustained violence can persist when victims are marginalized and warning signs are ignored.